Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, I appreciate you watching. And so today we're going to be looking at Module 2 material, right? You know, we said one of the things that we like to do is we can, or let me rephrase, it's late in the day. One of the things that I'm doing in this course is, one, I'm doing next module material before the module starts, right? So end of module 1 is today. Module 2 starts officially tomorrow. Another thing that I'm trying to do in this course is a lot of the modules are 2-week modules instead of just 1-week modules, just to give you kind of more time to be in the material and work on things. And then again, today, like I mentioned last week, one of the things that I am trying not to do is I'm trying not to rely heavily on PowerPoint for these classes. So I want the live streams and stuff to be primarily demonstration, discussion that we do through those channels. Right, so I know I rely a lot on PowerPoints in some other classes to, kind of display some information. I don't want to do that in this class. I want to primarily be in the code and be working with the code. Because at the end of the day, that's the important thing that comes out of it. So we're going to be working on Module 2 material today, which is about components. We'll start Module 2 today. We'll do a little bit with it. And then we'll continue it next week, right? Because it's a 2-week module. And so what I want to do here is I just want to create a new React project, and I just want to work through some things and talk about some things as we're kind of going through. Right, so I'm going to go to terminal to open up a new terminal. And we're just going to start the process here just kind of like what we did last week. I'm just going to navigate and create a new directory. And inside of this directory is where we're going to make our project. So I'm making it in my Web 285 directory. We can kind of zoom in on what we've got going on here. You can see that I have the test project here that we did last week, or our first project here that we did last week, with a couple of other things in here. So what we'll do is we'll just start by writing our commands that we learned about in Module 1 for create React app. So that is npx. npx being our package runner that is a part of npm. Create -react -app, and then the name of our app, and we'll call this component -test. And so that'll create a folder in our Web 285 folder here called component-test, and it'll start to download all of the requisite React files into that folder. So let's make it go. And so remember, one of the things about React that is kind of a meme is how long it can take sometimes to get all these files. So we'll just give it a few minutes here to do its thing. All right, so it looks like our files have finished being downloaded. Oh man, it really is late in the day. So I am going to cd into that folder. I'm going to cd into component-test. And I'm going to start the application. npm start. And that'll take a second, and it'll start my server. And it'll open up my React app, and it's opened it up in my browser here. It's on my other window. Looks like I might need to recompile here, or maybe create a new project, because it's caused me a bit of a fit here. Let's see here what my error message is. Plugin React was conflicted between package.json. Let's open up that folder. ext. Web 285. Component test. And let's look at package.json here to see if there's anything crazy here. Doesn't look like it. Let's try to refresh our React app, see what that does. It's down because I stopped the run, because I closed my terminal. So let's run npm start again here. And there we go. This time it compiled successfully, so it must have just been a little compilation glitch. I can pull it over here just so we can see our base React application. And I'm going to keep it on my second monitor here just to kind of make it a little bit easier to go back and forth with as we're editing it. So last week we started looking at React. Or I should say, especially if I want to reuse these videos. In Module 1, we started looking at React. And we started looking at a React application. And we looked at this baseline React application that we have here. And if we go into our source file and we go into our app.js file here, we see the default app that we're given. Right, we see that we're importing logo from logos.svg. This is understanding the import statements are going to be something that we want to deal with in this module. We see that we're importing a CSS, a style sheet here from app.css. App.css is here. So this is one of the ways that we bring in a style sheet, is that we have to import a style sheet into a React file so it can actually be used on the site. Basically, any external document or anything that we want to be able to use, we have to import it to be able to use it. But the big thing here that I want us to start with is I want us to start by looking at our primary component here, which is our app component. And it's written here in the function method. And one of the things that your module shows you is that you can switch this over into the arrow notation method. So I can switch that over to be arrow notation format, and it's going to work exactly the same. And so when I'm creating a component, I can kind of treat my component as if it were a tag, right? Which is kind of interesting. I can create a new component as a new function, and I can put things in it, right? So let's say I wanted to take our site here, and I wanted to make a new piece to it. And this is one of the big things where we can kind of get into modularity in React, which is pretty cool. Right, so just for our purposes here, I'm going to take out everything between these div tags in our app function. Remember that it's smart to have one of these container tags, like a div tag, in your component, because at the end of the day, right, you can only have one parent tag in a component, right? If I tried to put another tag here down below this and make that render, it's not going to render. But I can put as much as I want inside of one parent tag, and it's going to render just fine. So let's build another tag here, and let's call this tag, or let's call this component rather, I should use the proper term, constant main, well, let's not call it main. I mean, we could call it main, but let's not call it main. Let's call it constant primary equals parentheses equals arrow, and there's our arrow notation. And remember that we could also do this just as easily, just as a regular function, function primary parentheses curly braces. Right? Both of these are valid ways to start a function for a component. Now, if we save this and we look at our site now, there's nothing there. Right? It's also giving us a little trouble down here because we've called this logo up here and we're not using it. So one of the smart ideas might be to just comment that out. But it's also telling us that we have primary here, but nothing is assigned to it or returned from it, right? So basically, that's one of the things that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add a return clause into this function. And that return clause is going to be the output of that function. Right? We can think about it just like a return statement in a regular function. So what is returned out of this function is going to be whatever we have between here. And just so we can put something here, we can just put a div. We can give it class name. Remember we said last week, one of the things that we have to do is, this is not HTML, it's JSX. So our standard HTML syntax of class isn't going to work here. We use class name, and we give it a value there. And then we have a div in there. And now that we have this sort of all populated and all filled out, we have something that'll work, right? Which is great. And so one of the things that we can do is we can put in, our standard tags in here. Remember, again, a lot of this looks like HTML, but it's not HTML. Now, if I save this, we're going to see, okay, well, it's still not doing really anything for us here. And that's because what we want to display on our page is ultimately what needs to be down here in this const app. Because if we look at index.js here, this is the file that's actually rendering. So I've moved from app.js to index.js. This is the file that's actually rendering our main page. And we can kind of talk through these different elements here. So import React from React. So it's importing the standard baseline React package from React. It's also importing React DOM to be able to get the virtual DOM. It's importing our CSS file. And it's importing our app.js file, our .app file. And it's also importing this report web vitals that gets us, our terminal output down here. It's creating a route React DOM here is creating a root, which is the root of the site, right? Because if we look in index.html, like there's really nothing there, right? Like if we look in public, there is an index.html in public. We can see there's a little bit of a skeleton here with a bunch of comments, but the only HTML in here is this div ID equals root. And that's the same root that's being referred to in our index.js here, right? You can see document.getElement by ID root, right? And as such, it's targeting the root that is in that index.html, which is this singular div, and it's putting anything that comes from our app component directly into there. Now, we could do this to where we also put in other components from the same file or other files. For the time being, it's just easier for us to kind of approach this by saying, you know, okay, as we work in our app.js file, we can make other components, and then we can take those other components and we can put them in our app component, and that will populate our page because our index.js is rendering out the results that we get returned from app.js. So essentially, when we're putting our component name in here, we're essentially calling the function that is our other component. So, you know, that's a good way that you can think about it, right? It's just like you are calling the function that is this component and running the code in here and returning it out and returning it into here, right? So we can add so in order to do that, I just create a tag that includes the name of the function that I want to include, and then I / greater than at the end to treat that like like we would treat a self-closing tag in HTML. So now when we look at that, we can see we have a hello world on our site. It looks like this again because we have a app.css file that's being imported. Right, if we go into our app.css, we can see that app.css text-align centers. We also have a media query here for browsers that prefer reduced motion. This is for accessibility purposes, right? If you remember, by default, it has that spinning React logo on it. If we remove all of this code from here, which we very well could do, and save, it's going to update our file accordingly. Now we can see that it still has a little bit of style to it, right? It still has a sans serif font, for example. And that is because there is more CSS here than just the app.css file, right? We can look in our files and we can see there's also an index.css here. And that's where it's providing us the sans serif here. So if we wanted to go to a serif font or another font, we would come into here and adjust this accordingly. Right? So if we stay in here, we can actually treat these different items like they're tags here. So I can make as many of these as I want. I can modularize different sections, right? Which is one of the things that, you know, people often do. Right? For example, one of the things that I might want to do is create another section for const header. Or let's do function header here. Function header. Just so we can see both examples. And we'll put our return statement in here. Everyone needs a return statement. We can add a little div into here. We can add a header tag into here. We can put an H1 here that says welcome to our site, or, you know, whatever we want it to say, right? Like this is just for demonstration purposes here. And all we would have to do is call that function inside of another function, whether it is our app function here or our primary function here. Right? I could put again, it's just like calling functions within a regular program. So I can make function calls inside of different functions, and they're just going to run in order. So for example, if I called this function here inside of primary, we'll put header here. That's our header component. So with the way that we have this laid out, if we look at the code afterwards, we're going to have a parent container called app. Inside of that, we're going to have a parent container called primary. Inside of that, we're going to have an H1. Next to that H1, we're going to have a div container. Inside of that div, we're going to have a header. And inside of that header, we're going to have an H1. So now if we take a look at our code, which is around here somewhere, we can see we get our hello world, and I want to save, forgot to save, and we get our welcome to our site. Right, and if we look at our page source here, and we just do a view page source, we can see that structure, or we can start to see that structure. I think actually what we want to do here is inspect element. If we inspect element, we can kind of see that structure that I'm talking about there. So let's expand our body, expand our root, and there we can see, okay, there's our app. There's our app container with the class of app, which is what we have created right here. If we expand that, we see our primary container. If we expand that, we see our hello world and our empty div. That contains our header, that contains our H1. All right, so that's some pretty complicated nesting right there. And one of the things that we can kind of get from that is one of the reasons why we would use React to do something like this, right? Because if we were to do this by hand and try to do this complicated nesting stuff here, that's going to present a bit of a challenge, right? And again, like in this example in particular, it's not a very useful or functional example. This is more of a proof of concept than anything, right? Next week, we'll do a little more function with what we do in the live class. But, if I look at my code here again, if I want to move that, I can just change its location by just moving around that particular tag. And ideally, I probably want to have that structured in my in my main app component here. Just so the structure there kind of makes sense. And I can still put it above or below primary as long as I don't put it outside of this container div that we have here. Remember, we can only have one parent here. So if we try to go outside of this and put that outside of our parent, now we have two parents in this one container, which it doesn't know what to do with. We can see it started throwing squiggly lines everywhere. If we save that, it throws us a million errors down here in our terminal. And if we look at our site, it's just gone buck wild over here. All right, so we want to make sure that we have all of that nested within the same parent container. And then everything's just fine. Now, one of the interesting things that we can do with these components is that we can run other code in them, right? What we do with a component is not limited to the return statement like we've done here, right? We've got 3 different components with 3 different return statements. And that's all we've kind of done with components so far. But as you see here, our components are created as functions. And they operate as JavaScript functions. So I can do any other sorts of operations that I want to do above my return statement, just so long as my return statement falls in the same kind of lines. Right? For example, I can console.log here. And I can put peekaboo here in my console log. Or if I wanted to, right, I could alert. Let's try to alert. Right, so I have an alert that's outside of my return statement. In my primary component, I have a little console log that's outside of my return statement in my app component. And if I save my site here, remember virtual DOM, so it's going to happen immediately, right? I immediately get my alert here, and if I look in my console, we can see peekaboo. And I have a special plugin in here for DevTools backend for React, which is why we see some things twice here. So we could, but that just goes to show us that we can run other JavaScript code inside of these functions, and we can even go so far as to make references to functions inside of these functions. Which is pretty good, right? A pretty important thing that we want to try to do here. So if we know that we can run code above the return statements in our components, then that also means that we can work with variables in our return statement, or before, in our components. We can work with variables. And that's super crucial here to what we're able to do. Right, that's going to help us a great deal. So for example, if I go into header here, and let's just say we do a little bit of work, right? Let's just say, for the sake of it, let's get the hour, right? So we're going to use the JavaScript time library, or the JavaScript time API, to use a date and time function to get the current hour. And we could do this with basically anything, right? So let's create a variable. We'll do a let. We'll call it hour, and we'll set it equal to the function call. So here that would be get hours dot to string. And so now we have, or actually it's get, and I believe that's time dot. That should be time dot also, I believe. So let me, or no, I need to create a date object. That's what I need to do. I'm forgetting things. It's the date API, not the time API. Even though we can do time in the date API, it's the date API. So if I created a new object, var cur hour equals new date, and then this would be cur hour dot get hours dot toString. And so then we can use this hour variable that we've created here inside of our return statement. Now, one of the challenges here, though, as you could probably guess, right, if we were using a regular little JavaScript program, we could just type our variable name in whatever we were working with, right? But this here, that's not formatted as a string would look in a regular program, right? It's formatted like we were writing HTML. There's no quotes, there's nothing setting it apart. So in React, it's a little bit different. It's the inverse, right? Instead of setting regular text apart, we set special text apart. So if I wanted to add this hour value here, I would simply just add it in curly braces inside of that H1 statement. So now when I save this, it still runs the alert, and I get our hour value of 16 here, right? Because we're in the 16th hour of the day. It's a 24-hour clock, right? So 16 would be 4 o'clock, 12 plus. Or 12 plus 4, 16. Now we could add some more code here, right? So instead of converting this to string, we could leave this as cur.getHours. That brings it in as an integer. So now hour is something that we can do math with. We can create another variable. Let's create another variable called hour output. And we'll just declare it for the time being, so we can assign it in a little bit. What I want to do is I'm just writing JavaScript, right? So this takes us back to what we were working on in the fall with our advanced JavaScript and stuff. So I can write a conditional statement here that can check to see the value of hour. If the value of hour is greater than 12, I can create something where our output shows me a PM with the number hour, or if it's less than, it can show me an AM, right? So we can do it like that. So we can write if hour greater than 12. Then we can set our value of our output equals hour minus 12. And one of the things that we might want to do here is we might want to take all of that and say dot to string and concatenate that with PM. Right, then we can write an else And in the event of else here, we'd do something similar. We just wouldn't subtract 12. And we would have an AM. And so now all we have to do is we just change the value of the hook that we're using here in H1 to output our output. And once we save there, we can see we get 4 o'clock p.m. Right, we could even add this to like another thing, right? Like we could create a paragraph here, still inside the header, still inside the div, right? And we can just write current hour output. Right, and for our purposes for the time being, right, let's remove that alert. Just so it stops annoying us. And we end up with this, right? Welcome to our site, current hour, 4 o'clock p.m. And we get our hello world. So we can see here that we can use just regular old JavaScript, right? Which is why, we kind of do these courses in this sort of order, right? This past fall, we did a big deep dive into JavaScript, and now we're using that JavaScript as we're talking about modern web development. And so we can take that variable and we can take the results from the variable from our date API to display the current date. We can also display the current minute. I could get fancy and make it refresh every minute so we could see current time. Right, there's a lot of stuff that could be done with this, right? Like we can take minute, use our get our minute function here. And we can say let minute equal current hour dot get minutes. So then maybe instead of current hour, we can do current time. And we can just concatenate the value of minute here, which would be minute dot to string. Minute dot to string. Just like that. We could do it here as well. Minute dot to string. Then we can save. And we can see, okay, current time, 4:40 p.m. Now we're missing our colon there. Forgot to add the colon. But I can do that with another concatenation, right? So we can just throw a colon in there just like that. Same thing here as well, right? So we're just using, and so now current time is 4:40 p.m. Current time is, in fact, 4:40 p.m. And so it actually wouldn't be very challenging to make this update every minute if we wanted to do something like that. But I think that's probably a good place for us to stop today. Let me just check my notes here really quickly. I think that's all that we kind of want to cover, though, in terms of kind of what we need to do. So just to kind of wrap up, we'll go through the GitHub process again. GitHub.com. Because today we created components, we used components from within components, and we used JavaScript outside of the return statement in our components in order to get some variable values that we could use in our components. So on GitHub here, I'm going to create a new project, right? We talked about SP23 components, PT1. So we talked about as we're working with our components, as we're working with our code and putting it on GitHub, we want to do two branches. We want to do one branch where we're just putting the code in there as the master branch. We want to do another branch where we are creating a live site just so we can see the site work, which requires something special since we're not using a standard MERN stack here. So in VS Code, I'm just going to hit Control-C here to terminate my server, which if we go back to my server now, we'll see that it is down, right? I just tried to refresh it and it's not there anymore. Remember that terminal has to be running. We will get init in this folder. We will get add period. We will get commit -m initial commit. And then from our GitHub here, we'll take our remote origin. And then we will get push origin master. And that sends my code to my GitHub. Right, and there we can see it's got all my React information, all my public, all my source. Right, I can go into app.js and I can see the changes that I made to the code. All well and good. Right, so now I can go back here. I can add the information that I need to add to export it to GitHub Pages, right? So we want to install the GitHub Pages package. So we're going to go npm install gh-pages --save-dev and hit that, and that's going to install the GitHub Pages library for React. I can go into my package.json now. I can add the home page, which goes under our version number here. So this will be home page. And we will use our home page layout that we're familiar with, which is https:// username. Right, and so my username is here, DE DE-ramsey.github.io/the repo name, which in this case I called it SP-23 components-PT1. I'm going to copy that because I will typo that almost assuredly. And we want to make sure that we put a comma after that because this is a JSON file. And then we want to add our lines to our scripts section to pre-deploy and build, or to pre-deploy and deploy rather. So let's find our script section here. Here it is. And just at the beginning of our script section here, I'm going to add a pre-deploy. And I need to put that in quotes. So pre-deploy colon npm run build with a comma at the end, and our deploy gh-pages -b, or I'm sorry, -d, and build with a comma at the end there. Make sure this is saved. And then we're just going to run our deploy script, which will automatically create another branch on GitHub pages, or on GitHub for our GitHub pages, and initialize the GitHub live site. So that'll be npm space run space deploy. Give that a second for it to work. Creating the production build. And it looks like we've got it. So if we go to our GitHub now, we can look in the settings. We can see pages here. We can see that we have a GitHub pages root that's been deployed. It just hasn't given us our URL yet. Might take a minute for that to come. If we go back to our repo, we can see that we have another GitHub Pages branch that we can look at that has our static site information on it. Let's see, has it generated our URL yet? Yes, it has. There it is. And there's our current site. And we can see that it's 4:48 p.m., which is exactly right. We've been doing this for 48 minutes now, which I think is long enough for this week. Remember, this is a 2-week module, so we're going to talk more about components and everything that we need to do next week. And I'll do a bit of a bigger demo that'll have a more finished site on it. Right, but I think this does a good job now to get us a proof of concept. So that's all that I have for you for this week. We'll turn on the music for just a minute, just in case, there are any questions, anything that anybody here who is with me live might want to know. But again, that's all that I have for you for this week. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.